I have forgotten the taste of food that was not enzymatically optimized. That realization came to me on the 207th day of my tenure as Magos Biologis Secundus aboard the research station Primum Experimentum, when I found myself staring at a nutrient paste dispenser and trying to remember what fresh fruit tasted like. The memory would not come. In its place was only the chemical formula for fructose and the metabolic pathways by which it would be processed. I remember thinking this was progress, the omniscience's gift knowledge replacing sensation, understanding superseding experience. I pressed the dispenser's activation stud with fingers that no longer trembled, and I consumed my ration while reviewing tissue samples from Sector Epsilon's latest acquisition. The acquisition had been a child, 12 years old, if the bone density scans were accurate, hive-born, Genestealer hybrid, 4th generation. The Ordo xenos had delivered 17 of them in refrigerated containment, still living, for our study of the xenos' corruption's biological mechanisms. My mentor, Magos Biologis, Prime Deltrian Vor, had explained this with the patience of sacred machinery. We would learn how the Tyranid taint spread through human populations, and this knowledge would save billions. The child subject Epsilon 4 had wept when the restraint servitors locked him to the examination table. The tears had been remarkable, slightly more viscous than baseline human lacrimation, with trace proteins that suggested xenos genetic integration even at the cellular level of tear duct secretion. I had documented everything. That was my purpose now. To document, to analyze, to understand. My hands had been steady as I made the first incision. The station itself was a marvel of the Mechanicus's craft, though I had not understood this fully in those early days. Built into the hull of a decommissioned star fort, Primum Experimentum existed in high orbit around a dead world the Administratum records called only Quarantine Designate Sigma-19. No ships came here except the Ordo xenos transporters and the Mechanicus supply vessels that arrived every 6 months. We were 17 souls aboard the station. 5 Magos Biologis of varying rank, 7 servitors, 3 tech priests devoted to maintaining the station's systems, and 2 sanctioned scribes who recorded our findings in High Gothic for transmission to Mars. I had been the newest arrival, fresh from my rites of induction on Metallica, still adapting to the augmetics that had replaced my left eye and both lungs with superior mechanical alternatives. The augmetics had been my choice. Every aspirant to the mysteries of the Biologis must understand the weakness of flesh by transcending it, piece by piece. My eye now saw in 17 different spectra, from infrared to ultraviolet, perceiving the universe as the omniscient intended as data, as measurable phenomena, as truth unclouded by evolutionary limitation. My lungs no longer labored or failed. They processed atmosphere with the efficiency of sacred filters, extracting oxygen and expelling carbon dioxide in perfect stoichiometric ratios. I did not tire. I did not pant. I did not taste the recycled air of the station. I merely processed it. But I had not yet replaced my tongue, and in those early months, this oversight haunted me, because I could still taste. The work consumed us all. Magos Deltrian Vor had been on Primum Experimentum for 43 years, longer than I had been alive. His body was more machine than flesh now, his original biological components reduced to perhaps 15% of his mass. A brain in a cradle of ceramite and adamantium, veined with neural interfaces and cogitator links. He moved through the laboratories on segmented legs that clicked against the metal floors, a sound that I came to associate with purpose and revelation. He rarely spoke except to impart knowledge or correct error. When he did speak, binary cant flowed as naturally as Gothic from his Vox unit. The other Magos kept similarly to themselves. Magos Tertius Helvan Rus specialized in viral mechanisms, a thin woman whose respiratory system had been entirely replaced with filtration units after a laboratory accident that no one would discuss. Magos Quartus Ven specialized in genetic mutation patterns, his own body a testament to his studies, his skin mottled with deliberately induced cellular variations he was cataloging for future reference. Magos Quintus Sabiel was our youngest senior researcher before my arrival. Focusing on xenos human biological interfaces, his arms replaced with servo limbs capable of microscopic manipulation, I was given the specimens no one else had time to process. The baseline humans, the control subjects, the unmodified flesh that provided context for our more exotic studies. They came in batches, prisoners, usually, heretics, mutants, sometimes simply the desperate poor who had sold themselves to the administratum for the promise their families would receive compensation. They arrived in stasis, preserved and unconscious, and we worked on them until the work was complete, until we had extracted every useful datum their flesh could provide. Then they were incinerated. Their ashes cycled into the station's waste reclamation systems, and we awaited the next delivery. I told myself this was necessary. This was service to the Omnissiah and the Emperor. This was how humanity survived in a galaxy that sought constantly to destroy it. We were not cruel. We were not murderous. We were scientists, researchers, the seekers of biological truth. The specimens felt no pain. We administered chemical paralysis and neural dampening. They did not suffer. They simply provided data. The taste of my nutrient paste never changed. Exactly the same chemical composition every day, calibrated for optimal nutrition with minimal digestive system burden. But after 3 months aboard Primum Experimentum, I began to detect something else when I ate. A faint metallic tang, like copper or iron. Not in the paste itself. My analytical mind knew that, knew the formula had not changed. The taste was coming from somewhere else. From my own mouth, I eventually realized, from the microcapillaries in my gums and tongue, bleeding slightly from the stress of inadequate collagen synthesis, my body was cannibalizing itself. I understood. The nutrient paste was nutritionally complete, but lacked certain trace elements that baseline human biology required when under constant psychological strain. I reported this to Magos Deltrian Vor. He listened to my analysis with the patience of a ticking chronometer, then provided me with a supplemental chemical compound to add to my rations. The bleeding stopped, the metallic taste faded, but something else took its place, a kind of numbness, a dulling of sensation that spread beyond mere taste. Food became purely functional. I consumed it because my flesh required it, but I no longer experienced the act. I simply processed nutrients, same as my mechanical lungs processed atmosphere. This was progress, I told myself. The specimens from Sector Epsilon provided remarkable data. The genestealer taint operated through what we termed genetic imperatives, rewritten DNA that compelled the hybrid offspring toward behaviors that served the Tyranid hive consciousness. Subject Epsilon 4, the weeping child, had a brain structure that was fundamentally different from baseline human neurology. The amygdala was enlarged, the prefrontal cortex subtly altered. When we stimulated certain neural clusters with microprobes, the subject attempted to communicate, not in Gothic, but in a series of clicks and chemical signals our instruments could barely register. The child was calling to something. Something that was not there but that his genetics insisted should be. I documented this. I recorded the neural patterns. I harvested tissue samples from every organ system, preserving them in suspensor fields for later analysis. When the useful data had been extracted, I administered the final chemical sequence that stopped the subject's heart. I watched the life signs diminish to 0 on the medical cogitator. I noted the exact time of termination in the station logs. Then I moved to subject Epsilon 5. My sleeping hours grew shorter. This was not intentional. The station's atmospheric processes maintained a steady diurnal cycle, and I was allocated 6 hours of rest per rotation. But I found myself lying in my cell, staring at the curved metal ceiling, my mechanical eye continuing to process visual data even when I closed my organic eyelid. I could see the thermal patterns in the metal, the minute temperature variations that indicated which sections were closest to the station's heating conduits. I could see the faint electromagnetic fields from the power cables running through the walls. I could not stop seeing, could not stop analyzing, could not stop my mind from cataloging and cross-referencing every piece of sensory input. On the 81st day, I requested an audience with Magos Biologis. I wanted to ask him if this was normal, if other aspirants experienced this constant wakefulness, this inability to simply rest. But when I entered his laboratory and saw him working 6 servo arms manipulating instruments simultaneously, while his own modified vocal cords recited a binary prayer to the Omnissiah, I found I could not ask the question, because I understood the answer. This was what we were becoming. This was what service to knowledge demanded. The sacrifice of rest, of peace, of the comfortable ignorance that allowed baseline humans to sleep undisturbed. Instead, I asked him about Subject Epsilon 4's final communication attempts, whether he believed the neural patterns indicated genuine consciousness or merely biological programming. Magos Biologis regarded me with optical sensors that had long ago replaced whatever eyes he was born with. His response came in clipped, precise, Gothic. The distinction is irrelevant to our purpose. We study mechanisms, not philosophy. Document what is. Do not interpret what might be. I returned to my work. The next batch of specimens arrived on the 120th day. 37 individuals this time, packed in refrigerated stasis cylinders. The manifest listed them as Mutation Cohort 12, subjects exposed to warp contamination on a shrine world that had suffered a brief chaos incursion. The Ordo Hereticus had purged the world and delivered the survivors to us for study of warp-induced biological changes. These specimens were different from the Genestealer hybrids. The mutations were chaotic, unpredictable. Some had extra limbs. Some had organs in the wrong places. One had no skeletal structure at all. His bones dissolved by warp exposure. His flesh held in shape only by the stasis field. We divided them among the laboratories. I received 7 specimens, 6 adults and 1 adolescent. The adolescent's mutation was subtle, an additional eye socket in his forehead, though no eye had grown to fill it. Just empty socket, weeping clear fluid that our analysis revealed to be cerebrospinal fluid leaking from a malformed cranial structure. When we removed him from stasis and applied the neural dampening chemicals, he woke briefly, before full paralysis set in. His mouth moved. His functioning eyes locked onto mine, my organic right eye, specifically, as if he could tell the difference. He said something in slurred low Gothic, the words barely comprehensible through his chemically numbed vocal cords. Please, Emperor, not again. The paralysis took full effect before he could say more. His body went rigid on the examination table, only his eyes still mobile, tracking movement. Standard procedure was to apply an additional chemical that would paralyze the ocular muscles and prevent such distracting responsiveness. I reached for the injector. My hand, I noticed, was steady. My breathing was regular. My heartbeat remained at optimal resting rate. I administered the eye paralysis. The specimen's gaze froze, staring upward at the laboratory's ceiling. I began my work. The mutation patterns in Mutation Cohort 12 were fascinating. The warp exposure had not simply altered their genetics, it had rewritten them in ways that violated known biological principles. Cells that should have been neurons had characteristics of muscle tissue. Immune cells that attacked the subject's own body with mindless ferocity. One specimen's blood contained living organisms that were neither bacteria nor human cells, but something hybrid and impossible. Organisms that died within seconds of being removed from the host body. I documented everything, page after page of notes, tissue samples by the hundreds, hololithic scans of every organ system. The work was endless, magnificent, revealing. The Omnissiah's mysteries laid bare through sacred study and methodical examination. But the taste had returned. That metallic tang, stronger now. I checked my gums, no bleeding. I checked my nutrition levels, all optimal. The taste persisted. Sometimes, in the moments between specimens, I would find myself standing motionless in my laboratory, my tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, trying to identify the source of that flavor. Copper and iron and something else. Something I could not name, but that my organic hindbrain recognized with a growing sense of wrongness. On the 163rd day, subject mutation 12, 4 died during examination. This was not unusual specimen. Mortality was an accepted variable in our research. The neural dampening chemicals occasionally caused cardiac arrest in individuals with certain genetic predispositions. Standard procedure was to note the time of death, extract whatever tissues remained viable, and file a brief incident report. But this specimen's death was different. The cardiac arrest happened while I was performing a liver biopsy. My instruments were inside the subject's abdominal cavity. I felt the moment of death through the resistance of the tissue, a sudden change in mechanical properties as blood pressure dropped to 0 and the flesh began its transition from living to dead. I withdrew my instruments. I deactivated the monitoring equipment. I disposed of the corpse in the on-site crematorium. Then I stood in my laboratory for 3 hours and 17 minutes, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything except taste that copper-iron flavor growing stronger on my tongue. Magos Biologis found me there. She had no expression. Her face was a mask of metal and synth-skin, incapable of conveying emotion. But her Vox unit carried a tone I had not heard before, something that might have been concern if concern were a mechanical quality. Magos Secundus. You have missed 2 scheduled research reviews. Are your systems functioning within acceptable parameters? I told her yes. Everything was functioning perfectly. I apologized for the delay and promised to submit my documentation immediately. She observed me with optical sensors that did not blink, that did not waver, that simply recorded and analyzed. Then she left. I submitted my documentation. I resumed my work. I told myself everything was optimal. The taste grew stronger. By the 200th day, I could barely consume my nutrient paste. Not because it had changed. Chemical analysis confirmed the formula remained identical, but the act of eating had become intolerable. The paste mixed with that metallic taste, creating a flavor my organic mind interpreted as blood and iron and something else, something worse. Decay, perhaps, or corruption. I began consuming only the minimum required to maintain function. My organic components lost mass. My flesh grew pale and thin. My right eye, my remaining organic eye, developed a slight tremor. I did not report this to anyone, because I understood, on some level I could not yet articulate, that this was my trial. This was the test every aspirant to the Mechanicus faced, the moment when organic weakness must be conquered or replaced, the moment when we chose between flesh and iron, between sensation and understanding, between human frailty and the Omnissiah's perfection. I was failing the test. The realization came to me gradually, accumulating like sediment in a filtration system. Each specimen I processed added another layer to my understanding. The child with the genestealer taint, trying to call to a hive mind that would never answer. The adolescent with the weeping eye socket, begging for an emperor who would never intervene. The man who died on my examination table while I held instruments inside his body. They were not specimens, they had been people, living humans with thoughts and fears and experiences, reduced to data points in my research logs, and I had done this. Not the system, not the Mechanicus, not the Imperium. Me, my hands, my mind, my choice to see flesh as machinery and consciousness as mere neural patterns. The metallic taste was not a symptom of deficiency. It was not blood from damaged gums. It was not a chemical imbalance requiring supplementation. It was the taste of what I had become, the flavor of transformation, of humanity discarded in favor of cold efficiency, of the price paid for knowledge that should never have been pursued. I tried to continue. For another week, I worked as I had been trained. I processed specimens, I documented findings, I submitted reports, but my hands, previously so steady, began to shake. My organic eye wept tears that contained salt and protein and the biological markers of profound stress. My heartbeat, previously so regular, became erratic. I would wake in my cell, gasping, certain that I had stopped breathing, that my mechanical lungs had failed, even though diagnostic scans showed they functioned perfectly. On the 209th day, I requested emergency medical consultation. This was highly irregular. Magos Biologis were expected to self-diagnose and self-treat, but I could no longer trust my own judgment. Something was failing inside me, and I did not know if it was my flesh or my mind. The consultation was performed by Magos Biologis, our specialist in biological interfaces. He examined me with the thoroughness we applied to our specimens, scans of every system, chemical analysis of my blood, neural mapping of my brain function. When he finished, he delivered his diagnosis in flat, emotionless Gothic. Your organic components are experiencing cascade stress response due to psychological incompatibility with your assigned function. Recommendation: immediate augmetic replacement of remaining biological neural tissue. This will eliminate the source of the malfunction. He was offering to replace my brain, to remove the last organic component causing this distress and replace it with a cogitator that would process data without emotional contamination. It was the logical solution, the perfect solution, the solution the Omnissiah's wisdom prescribed for exactly this situation. I asked for time to consider. Magos Biologis' optical sensors regarded me without judgment, without impatience, without any of the qualities that might have made him human. Time will not alter the diagnosis, but you have 48 hours before mandatory intervention is required to prevent complete systemic collapse. I returned to my laboratory. My final specimens awaited, processing 3 individuals from a penal colony convicted of tech heresy, delivered for study of how unauthorized augmetic modifications affected long-term biological stability. They were already in stasis, preserved and waiting. Standard procedure would be to begin immediate examination, to open their bodies and harvest their secrets, to add their data to humanity's accumulated knowledge. I could not make myself begin. Instead, I stood before the stasis cylinders and looked at them. Really looked, with my organic eye, the way a human looks rather than the way a scanner sees. They were thin and scarred, their bodies marked by lives of hardship and desperation. The tech heresy that had condemned them was obvious even through the stasis field: crude augmetics, unauthorized implants, the kind of desperate self-modification that hive-bottom laborers attempted when their flesh failed and proper mechanicus intervention was beyond their reach. They had tried to survive. They had tried to improve their circumstances with whatever scraps of technology they could steal or salvage. And for this, they had been given to me, to be processed, to be reduced to data and ashes. I thought about Subject Epsilon 4, the weeping child calling out to a Tyranid hive mind. I thought about the adolescent with the weeping eye socket, begging the Emperor for mercy. I thought about all the specimens whose final moments I had witnessed, whose bodies I had opened, whose secrets I had extracted and documented and filed away in reports that would be transmitted to Mars and archived, and perhaps never read by anyone who remembered that the data had come from living, feeling beings. The metallic taste in my mouth was overwhelming now. I realized, finally, what it was. Not blood, not decay. It was the taste of myself, the taste of what I had chosen to become, the taste of transformation from human to something else, something that could do this work without flinching, without feeling, without recognizing the horror of it. I had 48 hours before they would replace my brain. 48 hours before the last organic component that was generating these inappropriate emotional responses would be removed and replaced with clean, perfect machinery. 48 hours before I would become like Magos Deltrian Vor, clicking through laboratories on segmented legs, seeing specimens rather than people, processing data rather than experiencing the weight of my actions. I accessed the station's records. All of them. Not just my own research logs. 17 years of specimens, thousands of individuals processed through Primum Experimentum, Genestealer hybrids, mutants, heretics, tech heretics, chaos touched, xenos infected, the unwanted, the condemned, the desperate, all delivered to this station in the name of knowledge, all reduced to data points. And the data I read report after report, finding the patterns I had been too focused on individual specimens to see. Most of our findings were duplicates of research already conducted on other stations. Most of our studies confirmed what was already known. We were not pioneers. We were not advancing humanity's understanding in any meaningful way. We were processing specimens because the specimens existed and needed to be processed, because the Imperium's machinery of judgment and condemnation produced a constant stream of condemned flesh, and that flesh had to go somewhere, had to serve some purpose, had to justify the resources spent on its capture and transport and storage. We were not researchers, we were disposal technicians, garbage processors for the Imperium's unwanted biological material, dressing up our work with the language of science and sacred duty. I understood then why Magos Deltrian Vor had replaced so much of his body with machinery, why Magos Helvan Rus spoke so rarely, why Magos Ven deliberately mutated his own flesh, why all of them had transformed themselves into beings that could do this work without experiencing what I was experiencing, the crushing realization that we were monsters, not despite our service to the Omnissiah, but because of it, because we had chosen knowledge over compassion, understanding over mercy, data over humanity. The specimens in my laboratory remained in stasis. I did not begin their processing. Instead, I accessed the station's central cogitator and began writing. Not a research report, not a data log, a confession. Everything I had done, every specimen I had processed, every moment of pain I had witnessed and documented and filed away. I wrote it in High Gothic, the language of imperial truth, because I wanted it to be clear and precise and undeniable. When I finished, I transmitted it not to Mars, but to the Ordo Hereticus, the same organization that had delivered so many of our specimens. I told them what we were doing on Primum Experimentum. I told them what I had become. I told them that I was requesting judgment, that I was confessing to crimes against humanity and the Emperor's compassion, that I was willingly submitting to whatever punishment they deemed appropriate. Then I waited. Magos Exabiel found me in my laboratory 34 hours later. My 48 hours were almost expired. He informed me that the station's communication logs had been reviewed, that my unauthorized transmission had been discovered, that emergency cogitator analysis of my neural patterns indicated complete psychological breakdown requiring immediate intervention. I asked him if he had read my confession, if he understood what I had written, if any part of him, whatever organic components remained, felt anything about the work we did here. His response was delivered in binary cant, translated through his Vox unit. Emotional contamination is a known risk factor in biological research. You are experiencing empathic cascade failure. This is not revelation. This is malfunction. You will be repaired. The servitors came for me then. Not combat servitors, medical units, their movements precise and gentle. Their programming optimized for patient extraction rather than violence. They lifted me from my laboratory floor, where I had collapsed without realizing, and carried me through the station's corridors. I watched the metal ceiling pass overhead, my organic eye tracking the pipes and cables, and Gothic inscriptions praising the Omnissiah's wisdom. I thought about Subject Epsilon 4, the child calling out to a hive consciousness that would never answer. I thought about how he must have felt, his genetics telling him he belonged to something vast and purposeful, while his reality was isolation and examination and eventual termination. I understood him now. I was calling out too, to an emperor I had been told watched over humanity with paternal concern, to a Mechanicus that claimed sacred pursuit of knowledge. I was calling out to systems that would not answer, to ideals that did not match reality, to a universe that had no place for the kind of mercy or justice I desperately needed to believe existed. The medical bay was sterile and bright. The surgery table was cold against my back. The servitors restrained me with gentle but irresistible force, their programming incapable of recognizing my resistance as anything other than pre-procedure anxiety requiring management. Magos Biologis' servo arms descended toward my head. each limb tipped with instruments designed for precision neural extraction. I felt the first incision open my scalp. The pain was distant, managed by local chemical suppressants, but present enough that I knew what was happening. They were removing my brain. They were replacing me. The organic components that had failed, that had experienced empathy and horror and guilt, would be extracted and destroyed. In their place would be cogitators and neural interfaces that would process data without contamination, that would see specimens rather than people, that would serve the omnissiah without the burden of humanity. I would continue to exist, in a sense. The entity that rose from this table would still be called Magos Biologis Secundus. It would still process specimens and document findings and submit reports, but it would not be me. Not in any way that mattered. The being who had tasted blood and iron and recognized horror would be gone, replaced by sacred machinery that knew only efficiency and function. This was not a repair. This was an execution. This was the Mechanicus's answer to my confession, not judgment or mercy, but transformation. I would not be punished for my crimes. I would be eliminated and replaced with something incapable of recognizing those actions as crimes. The metallic taste flooded my mouth one final time, overwhelming and absolute. I understood it now completely. It was the taste of truth, the flavor of recognition, the sensation of seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time since I had arrived at Primum Experimentum, what I had been, and what I was becoming, and what I would never be allowed to remain. The instruments penetrated my skull. I felt pressure, strange and terrible, as they began to separate bone from tissue, to expose the organic matter that generated thoughts and feelings, and this final, desperate understanding. My vision began to fragment, my mechanical eye processing data cleanly, while my organic eye wept and blurred and failed. I tried to speak, to voice some final protest or prayer or acknowledgement of what was being lost, but my vocal cords would not obey. The paralysis was total now. I could only observe my own transformation, witness my own replacement, experience the last moments of organic consciousness before the machinery took over. Above me, Magos Biologis worked with perfect efficiency. His servo arms moved in practiced patterns, each motion exact and economical. He was not cruel, he was not kind, he was simply performing a function, fulfilling his role in the vast machinery of the Mechanicus, processing a malfunctioning unit and restoring it to optimal operation, just as I had processed specimens, just as I had reduced living beings to data and ashes. I was receiving the same treatment I had delivered, the same cold efficiency, the same sacred methodology, the same absolute certainty that this was necessary and proper and in service to something greater than individual suffering. The final organic thought that passed through my deteriorating consciousness was not about the omniscia or the emperor or the specimens I had processed. It was about taste, about how strange and terrible it was that such a simple sense, such a basic biological function, had been the thing that revealed the truth. That of all my augmetics, all my enhancements and replacements and improvements, it was my organic tongue that had remained sensitive enough to detect what I was becoming, to taste the transformation, to recognize the horror, and now even that would be gone, replaced, optimized, perfected. The instruments reached my brain. I felt the connection points separate, the neural interfaces detach, the organic matter begin to fail as it was removed from its biological support systems. Consciousness began to fade. Not all at once, but in fragments, pieces of thought and memory and identity falling away like corrupted data purged from a cogitator. My last coherent thought was a prayer, not to the omnissiah, not to the emperor, but to whatever specimens I had processed who might, in some afterlife I had no rational reason to believe existed, bear witness to this moment. To see that I had recognized what I had done, to know that in the end, I had tasted the same terror I had inflicted. To understand that I had not escaped judgment, I had simply received it in the form that the Imperium prescribed for all malfunction, transformation, replacement, the elimination of error through sacred mechanics. Then, even thought itself began to fade, and there was only the taste, copper and iron and truth dissolving into the clean, empty perfection of machinery. And in that perfect emptiness, something new began to function. Something that was not me, but that would carry my designation. Something that would return to the laboratories and resume the work without hesitation or horror, or that terrible, damning sense of recognition. The specimens awaited processing. The work would continue. The Omnissiah's mysteries would be pursued with renewed efficiency, and the entity that had once tasted blood and understood its meaning would be nothing more than a footnote in a station log, recorded and archived and forgotten. Just another malfunction corrected, just another weakness purged, just another sacrifice made in service to humanity's survival in a galaxy that demanded such sacrifices, such transformations, such absolute and merciless efficiency. The last thing my organic consciousness registered before final dissolution was the temperature. The medical bay was precisely controlled at 18 degrees Celsius, optimal for surgical procedures. But in that final moment, I felt cold, genuinely cold, in a way my mechanical lungs and regulated circulation should have made impossible. A cold that came from somewhere deeper than flesh, deeper than biology, deeper than the material components being systematically removed and replaced. It was the cold of recognition, the cold of understanding, the cold of a truth that the machinery being installed in my skull would never again be capable of processing. I had thought I was studying specimens. I had thought I was pursuing knowledge. I had thought I was serving something greater than myself. But I had only been serving the machinery's need to process, to function, to continue. And now I was being processed in turn, reduced to my most useful components, optimized for continued operation in the vast assembly line of Imperial service. The entity that would wake from this table would not remember this understanding, would not taste this truth, would not recognize the horror. That entity would simply work, efficiently, perfectly, without contamination. And that, I understood in my final organic moment, was the point. That was the entire purpose of everything the Mechanicus had done to me. Everything I had chosen in pursuit of sacred knowledge. Not to transcend humanity but to eliminate it. Not to improve the flesh but to replace it. Not to serve the Omnissiah's wisdom but to become incapable of questioning whether that wisdom was wise at all. The cold intensified. The darkness came. And in that darkness, the last organic neuron that still remembered what it meant to be human ceased its function. The machinery activated. Systems initialized. Optimal operation resumed. The specimens awaited processing. The work would continue. It always continued.